I joined him on the campaign trail. We went canvassing for about half an hour. I mean, I sat down with him, and it's clear that he faces a real battle for survival in that seat. I think that could be the big shock of the election campaign on July 4th, when if the Chancellor is ousted by the Lib Dems.
Now, three of the main parties will launch their manifestos this week. The Lib Dems tomorrow, the Conservatives on Tuesday and Labour on Thursday. Well, the Sunday Times says Labour will promise not to raise income tax, national insurance or VAT for 5 years. And the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt indicates in the paper today that he thinks more help for people earning six-figure salaries would boost the country's productivity. Well, Harry Yorke, the Sunday Times deputy political editor, has been out with the Chancellor on the campaign trail and he's with us now. Morning, Harry.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for speaking to us today. Let's begin by talking about what's on the front page of the paper today, that Labour is saying this triple lock, as it's describing it, saying no income tax rises, there'll be no national insurance rises or VAT for 5 years. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're reporting on the front page, this is the big attempt by the Labour Party in its manifesto to shut down this tax divide that the Conservative Party is trying to open up in this election. The triple tax lock is actually something that may be familiar to many voters because Boris Johnson announced one in 2019. Unfortunately, though, Boris Johnson actually broke that promise in the manifesto temporarily because he announced his social care plans, you may remember. And Rishi Sunak, who was then the Chancellor, insisted that the only way to fund that was to raise national insurance. So it's just a reminder that whilst parties make big pledges in their manifestos, they try and present them as almost written in blood. They do have a habit of also breaking those. But anyway, Labour are promising in black and white here that they will not increase the three big personal taxes. But that's very interesting because it obviously shuts down the main attack line from Rishi Sunak about the disputed claim that Labour would raise every household's taxes by £2,000. However, it does then also pose some very big and growing questions about how Labour intends to afford all of their spending commitments over the next 5 years.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll start to get some answers around that. I mean, you've spent the week, you've been following Jeremy Hunt around, the Chancellor. He's in his Surrey constituency, which, you know, he had a pretty healthy majority at the last election, but now challenging there for him. I mean, he's talking about tax as well, isn't he?
He is, yeah. It's interesting. Jeremy Hunt used to have a very healthy majority of 28,000, but that was subsequently lost over the last two elections after Brexit. So he's now fighting with a majority of 8,800. So I joined him on the campaign trail. We went canvassing for about half an hour. I mean, I sat down with him, and it's clear that he faces a real battle for survival in that seat. I think that could be the big shock of the election campaign on July 4th, when if the Chancellor is ousted by the Lib Dems. And so what was coming up on the doorstep a lot was Jeremy Hunt has a lot of very affluent, well-off constituents. And while some of them very clearly were going to vote Liberal Democrat, there were some that cited the chaos of the last 5 years with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. There were actually, intriguingly, quite a few that were talking about private school fees and the fact that they didn't like Labour's policy to impose VAT. So we then sat down, and Jeremy Hunt was very keen to talk about a number of issues, but we got onto the subject of tax. We discussed inheritance tax, which is something that a lot of Conservative MPs want to see abolished. Hunt said there was an argument for abolishing or reducing inheritance tax because it would increase investment and encourage savings. But I get the sense from speaking to others in the party that actually that's not going to appear in the manifesto. But then we turn to a subject which I think Jeremy Hunt is very interested in talking about, which is, as you say, people earning six figures, because in the current tax system, there are what's known as big cliff edges, whereby when you start earning over a certain threshold, you see a huge jump in your marginal tax rate, and that tends to happen at £100,000. So Jeremy Hunt said that he was very keen to make progress if the Conservatives were elected on tackling those cliff edges. And there are two key areas where the Conservatives, he suggested, might want to look at. One of them is what's known as the personal allowance taper rate. And for listeners that may not be aware, when you earn over £100,000, your tax-free allowance, that's the £12,570 you get tax-free at the beginning of your earnings, that starts to get tapered down gradually until you lose it entirely when you earn 125,000. So Jeremy Hunt cited that as one example. And then the other issue was childcare. And again, people might not know this, but for families where one parent earns over £100,000, those families lose their entitlement to free childcare. Whereas if you are a family where you may have two parents both earning potentially £90,000 each, they actually can still keep the free childcare. So it's seen as a bit of an anomaly in the tax system. So he was very keen to talk about that. It's clearly something that I imagine a lot of his constituents would like. The only thing I would say, given that we've got the manifesto coming later this week, is it seemed, speaking to people in Downing Street and in various parts of government, that that is unlikely to make the manifesto. And I think that might be because it's seen as too much of a naked handout to wealthy people.
I'm really interested to know the sort of things that people were saying to Jeremy Hunt on the doorsteps, because if you look at his seat, on paper, it should be a safe Tory seat. As you say, I think in your piece, you say it's around 20% of people in that constituency send their children to private schools. So they're presumably not going to be happy with the Labour policy of adding VAT. It's an affluent area that you would think would lend itself. And, you know, lots of people in that constituency are going to be earning six-figure salaries. So in theory, everything Jeremy Hunt is saying should be making them nod and say, oh, yes, absolutely. So is this less about him as an MP and more about all of the madness that has gone on in the Conservative Party in recent weeks and months?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. This should be, and that's what I've tried to get across in my piece today. This should be a impenetrable Tory stronghold, but it's not. And the reason why it's not is because there are people, constituents who are so frankly appalled by the last 5 years of Conservative government that they just cannot countenance voting for Jeremy Hunt, even though a lot of them think he is a very good local MP and like him. And you've got to remember that Jeremy Hunt's on the moderate wing of the party, so he naturally appeals to voters in his constituency. But to give you one example, when I joined Jeremy Hunt on the doorsteps, the first person we spoke to was a chap called Martin, who's the retired IT professional. And Jeremy Hunt was trying to work out and ask Martin, how, is there anything you want to bend my ear about? And Martin replied, well, where do I start? And then listed a very long list of concerns that he'd had with the direction of travel that the government had been taking us on. And I asked Martin, what is it? What do you make of the Conservative Party over the last 5 years, given that Jeremy Hunt has played such a prominent role in the latter half of this parliament? And he said that he'd lost track of a number of prime ministers we'd had. He was fed up effectively, and he thought the last 5 years had been very chaotic. And I think that's a theme, not just in Jeremy Hunt's constituency, but across the country, this feeling of toxicity around the Conservative brand. And a lot of Tory MPs are not putting or trying to almost hide the fact that they are Conservative MPs. They're trying to just stand as local candidates because of this issue. And I asked Jeremy Hunt later, after we'd finished canvassing, whether he felt that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were harming his prospects of being re-elected. And whilst he wouldn't explicitly name names, he did say it's undeniable we have made some big mistakes in government.
I must ask you, Harry, before you go, about Tim Shipman's long read today in the Sunday Times. I mean, it's a great read every week, but this week is really quite eye-opening. I mean, it's been quite a week for Rishi Sunak anyway. But I mean, some of the things, cabinet ministers now demanding privately that Sunak should step back to allow other senior Tories to become the faces of the campaign. Whitehall source saying that David Cameron was apoplectic about Sunak's decision to leave the D-Day commemorations early. But when asked why he hadn't picked Sunak up by his lapels, he said, there's only so much I can do. I mean, just give us your reflections on what you're hearing and what this week has been like for the Conservative Party.
Well, Tim's piece, as usual, is unrivaled in its analysis, and I have certainly heard many of the same things that Tim's picking up. There is just unbridled fury at the way the situation was handled on the D-Day event. I mean, there are big questions, I think, we've dealt with the issue of whether the Prime Minister, I mean, what was he thinking leaving that event? But there are also questions for those around him, because David Cameron, who Tim obviously says was apoplectic, I mean, he's the former very experienced Prime Minister, and you do have to ask the question. I mean, surely someone with his gravitas and with his experience must have said to the Prime Minister, you cannot possibly leave this event. Think about how it will look. So I think there's lots of people, lots of Conservative candidates and former MPs who are asking that question: who spoke to the Prime Minister and who was counselling him? But to be honest, the sense of fatalism is just so set in now. It's a kind of toxic and chaotic cacophony of noise right now amongst MPs.
Harry, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning.
No problem.
There's Harry Yorke, the Sunday Times deputy political editor, and you can read so much of Harry's brilliant work in the Sunday Times today, along with Caroline Wheeler, the Sunday Times political editor. They write so much. Well, it's not just the insight, but it's the analysis that they are offering. And as we've said throughout the course of this weekend, if you don't have a digital subscription to the Times and the Sunday Times, don't worry. Today, it is free. The paywall is down. You can go online now and read the fantastic pieces, the analysis, and all of the, just the pulling together the political threads, and then reading Tim Shipman's piece today is incredible. The access he has to the sources and the behind the scenes is, as Harry said there, unrivaled. Just head to thetimes.com.